Hi everyone, Carl Steele here for English 4113, 4114, Brooklyn College, spring 2022, talking about Margaret Garner and the Fugitive Slave Law. So the US Constitution in its earliest version has in Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, this language: no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. What this language is designed to accomplish is to ensure that anyone who is enslaved in one state who makes their way to a state where slavery is outlawed is not going to be free as a consequence of having got into that free state. In around the time of the signing of the Constitution, 1787, a number of states have already outlawed slavery: Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, not New York, incidentally, not New Jersey, not Delaware, not Maryland, certainly not the South, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. So this is already showing that the Constitution is riding roughshod over the states' rights of free states. That although the American Civil War is often understood as a war in which the South is defending the rights of its state laws and cultures against the federal government, we can understand that the federal government is, from its very inception, weighted towards the rights of the South and effectively disallowing the outlawing of slavery in those states that chose that particular path. That's something I think we need to understand. States' rights goes both ways. So this law is effective only to the degree that people choose not to resist it. And there are a number of laws that are passed in the free states to try to soften its ability to return enslaved people to slavery. So we see the Fugitive Slave Act is one of these attempts to strike up in favor of the Constitution. There's a number of such laws. This is from 1850. If you read it, beginning of Section 6 is essentially the same language as the Constitution. The two things I really want to call attention to are this: in no trial or hearing under this act shall the testimony of such a alleged fugitive be admitted in evidence. That is, the person who has been charged with being a so-called fugitive slave cannot speak up in court to defend themselves. So whether they are free in actuality, whether they are enslaved and are liberating themselves, if they are captured, they cannot speak up in their defense. They are obligated to remain silent during that trial. Furthermore, the law states this: marshals, deputies, clerks, and special officers to receive their just fees. Commissioners shall receive $10 if the fugitive is given up to the claimant. Otherwise, they'll just get $5, which is paid by the claimant. The claimant is the person who is claiming this particular individual as their property. So you have to picture this then: the person who is accused of being escaped property cannot speak up in trial. If they are judged to be escaped property, then the person who has captured them gets a $10 bounty. If they are judged to be not escaped property, then the claimant pays only $5. So you can see that there's a financial incentive for everybody, except of course for the Black person who's being put on trial, to decide that this person is in fact a fugitive slave, regardless of their status. There's money involved, and the law is weighted in the direction of enslaving any Black person whom a slave catcher can get their hands on, regardless of whether that person is free or not free legally. So again, you can see the states' rights here is biased in favor of the slave states. So we see this especially in the Margaret Garner case. So I'm asking you to read some material from a book called The Fugitive Slave Law and Its Victims from 1861, published by the American Anti-Slavery Society in New York. In New York at that time, would have been fighting in defense of the federal government, but the city of New York was very much involved in profits from slavery and, in fact, was not particularly loyal to the federal government at this time. So at any rate, this is where the book is published. Margaret Garner makes her way to Cincinnati, Ohio from Kentucky, escaping across the frozen river with her family. And as you will hear about in Tuesday's class, when she is found out by the slave catchers, when her husband, although armed with a pistol, is not able to keep them away from his family, she eventually makes the decision, quite sudden, to kill as many of her children as she can get her hands on to prevent them from being taken back into slavery. The state of Ohio decides that they want to try her for murder. And the state of Kentucky says there is no such trial necessary. We simply want her returned to us. And what effectively this means is that we have the federal government weighing in on the side of Kentucky, and Ohio saying, no, we are going to defy both Kentucky and the federal government and try her for murder, with the obvious goal of finding her innocent and therefore allowing her and the remaining members of her family to escape. Unfortunately, she is found she's returned to slavery. So that is not, that particular strategy does not eventually work. But again, I want to stress that this is a case where states' rights are being trampled. States' rights can go both ways. So one thing that you're going to encounter in reading this material is a reference to one of the pro-slavery people in court. Colonel Chambers, counsel for the slave claimants, in his argument, reads long extracts from a pamphlet entitled A Northern Presbyter's Second Letter to the Ministers of the Gospel of All Denominations on Slavery by Nathan Lord of Dartmouth College. So he draws from a pro-slavery book and reads it in court. I managed to track this down. I found a book by John R. McKivigan, actually using Google Books, The War Against Pro-Slavery Religion, Abolitionism, and the Northern Churches, 1830 to 1865, published by Cornell University Press in 1984, who talks about this work. And then I managed to find Nathan Lord's book itself on archive.org. The book was published in 1855. He was the president of Dartmouth College, which is still there in New Hampshire. 1828 to 1863 is when he served as the president of that college. Here is part of his argument. If God has judged slavery important in his scheme of providence, then there is no principle of morals, no doctrine of religion, no interest of the state, no condition of the church, present or prospective, that would not suffer, not from the correction of its abuses, but from its abolition, while the reasons of it continue. It could not cease before its natural period, without a derangement whose course and consequences could be calculated only by omniscience. It might hasten the general catastrophe of the nations. It might produce a wreck of all things. It might make me miss my bus. Who knows? The effects we don't know. Only God would know. So we can talk about Nathan Lord's interesting reasoning in class on Tuesday. I find it a little weak, but it's interesting that this is the argument he's making. It's clearly he's begun with the belief that slavery is something that God wants and is trying to write an argument to defend an already predetermined set of beliefs. So you can imagine the effects of this being read in court. The people who want to believe it will believe it, and the people who don't want to believe it, of course, will see through its errors. So there's a fair amount of writing about Margaret Garner herself. Toni Morrison would have encountered this work in a book called, I believe it's called The Black Book of Slavery. It was a collection of stories about slavery, factual stories that were published in the early 70s. And this is the thing that eventually inspired her to write her novel Beloved, published, I believe, 1987, which was one of the works that was instrumental in her eventually winning the Nobel Prize in Literature. But people have also written more directly about Margaret Garner. So Morrison is inspired by the story. She's not going to follow it exactly. Stephen Weisenberger's book, Modern Medea, A Family Story of Slavery and Child Murder from the Old South, and a book by Mark Reinhardt, who speaks for Margaret Garner, where he is drawing on as much factual information in primary documents as possible to try to tell the story. Not a lot of them, of course, are going after Morrison for writing a novel. Morrison is writing a novel. Weisenberger and Reinhardt are trying to more directly write the story of Margaret Garner. So you can read more information on her and works like that. That Modern Medea title comes from an article from Harpers Weekly, published in, as we can see, I believe it's 1867. This Harper's Weekly is now Harper's Monthly. It's a magazine that is still being published. And here we have a discussion of a painting by Thomas Noble, which I'm about to talk about. And I will show you the illustration from Harper's Weekly in the next slide. One thing I do want to call attention to, though, is the material down at the bottom. So they're telling the story of Margaret Garner. The door of the apartment in which she had taken refuge was broken open, and the pursuers entered to behold the horrible scene which the artist has so powerfully depicted. Margaret Garner, with a far nobler jealousy than that which actuated the mythical Medea, finding her children were about to be given up to the slavery she had endured, seized a knife and took the lives of 2 of them. Before she could slay the others, she was seized by her horror-stricken but heartless pursuers. After her capture, she sank into speechless stupor, and while being returned to slavery, eluded the watchfulness of her guard and plunged into the Ohio River and found freedom there. So you will notice we're going to see in this material some difference in the number of children that she's reported to have killed. That data is going to be, somewhat sketchy given the archival capacities of these writers and their reliability. So that's something perhaps to pay attention to. How many of them does she actually kill? That's going to vary from work to work. The story of Medea is a mythical story. It's from Greek mythology. She has been spurned by her lover, Jason. He is taken up with a younger wife, and she has decided to take revenge on him by murdering his wife with a poisoned cloak and then slitting the throats of her 2 children and then leaping into a flying chariot and flying away because she is a witch. And she is certainly not someone who should be crossed. It's a quite thrilling work, and there's a couple plays about her that date, to the ancient Greeks. So that's what's being invoked here in that title, The Modern Medea. Here is that particular work that the Harper's Weekly article is talking about, Thomas Satterwhite Noble's painting, here represented as an engraving called Margaret Garner from Harper's Weekly, May 18th, 1867. So you will see here Margaret Garner looking across at the slave catchers. She is pointing down to 2 killed children. We have 2 other children holding onto her, either to plead for their lives or to try to get away from the slave catchers. It's a little ambiguous, which I think is something we can talk about in class. We have this man looking in horror, their eyes meeting each other here, this man looking panicked and holding a piece of paper, which is perhaps the writ of arrest or perhaps even the Fugitive Slave Law. It is certainly a piece of writing that is authorizing them to enter this and to try to recapture her. So that is the work that is in Harper's Weekly. Then we have some discussion here from Leslie First, The Modern Medea and Race Matters, Thomas Satterwhite Noble's Margaret Garner. It's a very good article from 1998 about that particular painting. And here is another summary of the actual events. Here is from Cincinnati Press, late January 1856. So this is from Ohio. This is pretty close to the actual time that this thing happened. Simon Garner Jr., Margaret's husband, sometimes referred to as Robert, fired 2 rounds from a revolver, and this kept the arresting party off for a while, but it was hopelessly clear that nothing could save the Garners from capture. Suddenly, Margaret Garner seized a butcher knife and turned upon her 3-year-old daughter. With swift and terrible force, she hacked at her child's throat. Again and again, she struck until the little girl was almost decapitated. The 2 Garner men, her husband and father-in-law, began to scream. Unable to bear the horror, they ran wildly about the cabin, that is the little room. Now, Margaret Garner turned towards one of her little boys, who pleaded piteously with his mother not to kill him. She called old Mary Garner, her mother-in-law, "Mother, help me to kill the children." The old woman began to wail and wring her hands. She ran for refuge under the bed. Finally, the wife of the owner of the house managed to disarm Margaret Garner, who all the while sobbed that she would rather kill every one of her children than have them taken back across the river into slavery. How many children does she kill? who's doing what during this situation, who stops her, how is the rest of the family responding. All these details are going to vary depending on who's telling the story. So that's something I want you to pay attention to over the next few weeks of discussion as we read through Beloved. So here is a different portrait of this. This is from the Pacific Appeal from 1862. This is an African-American newspaper published 1862 to 1880 in San Francisco. So this is presumably a Black writer. And this version, if you pause the slide and decide you want to read this, this is a story that concentrates on Robert Garner, her husband, here being called Robert, and his heroism. They'll remember how Robert Garner stood bravely in the door of his cabin, keeping the deputy marshal and his assistants at bay with his revolver and such other weapons as were within reach, while Margaret was slaying her children within, not their children, but her children, rather than have them dragged back into a life of slavery. A darling daughter was killed and a younger son wounded almost fatally. Now, in this case, only one dies. Before the brutal hirelings of slavery burst in and caught them all, they were finally carried off and sold south. Robert could have escaped, having frequent opportunities, but he would not leave his aged father and mother, whom he was resolved to free. Later on, it calls him the heroic Robert Garner. So here is a story that is highlighting the contributions of the husband rather than focusing on Margaret Garner. And I think that's also an interesting way to tell the story. Of course, Robert survived the war. Margaret did not. So there are also reasons, I think, that Robert's story, or rather Garner's husband's story, is being highlighted here. So let's come back to this painting. I think what Thomas Satterwhite Noble's painting, now here's the actual painting, 1867, is recalling is this painting by Jacques-Louis David, his Oath of the Horatii, 1784. So we have these triangles here, which is really striking. And that same kind of triangle composition is being used here. To me, the resemblances are quite striking. And if I were an art historian, I could probably do this much more richly and perhaps much more accurately. But I do think that Noble would have known the David painting. It's quite famous already, and perhaps would have had this story in mind. This is a story about a threat to Rome, and rather than sending one army against another, what the two sides elect to do is to select 3 champions from each side to fight, and whoever's side is victorious in this combat of 3-on-3 would determine the overall victory. So rather than thousands upon thousands dying, at most only 2 or 3 or possibly 6, if they're very unlucky, would die. Here are 3 brothers who take an oath to defend Rome. 2 of them are killed in this combat. One of them manages to get the enemy brothers basically to chase after him, and while they're separated, he is able to kill them one by one and is victorious. But in the process, of course, 2/3 of the sons of this family die. And perhaps that story of a dead family and an oath for liberation is the sort of thing that Thomas Satterwhite Noble had in mind when he was doing his painting. So I can tell you a little bit more about him in class on Tuesday and his background. He is a white painter. He is from a family that were slavers. He fought against the federal government during the Civil War, so fought in defense of slavery. But surely after the war, perhaps he became an anti-slavery person, or perhaps he saw which way the wind was blowing temporarily and decided that the thing to do was to celebrate the catastrophe or the tragedy of the story of Margaret Garner to illustrate how cruel slavery was. So here is a pencil sketch, which also survives by Noble. And I think there's a couple of things that I really want to point attention to in this version. It's obviously, it's less dramatic, I think, than the original one. You can see what it is he's intending to do, but the triangles aren't really quite as striking in this version. The room is much more bare. That we have 3 children here who are dead or severely wounded on the floor. We have only 1 child holding onto her apron. This man still holding that piece of paper. So it's been part of the conception since the earliest period when he was conceiving this. And then the one thing in this particular drawing that is lacking from the painting and from the engraving, which is the weapon that Margaret Garner used to try to kill her children. And we could talk in class about why Thomas Noble takes that out of the final version. So thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to Tuesday's conversation.